Okay, it's time to get serious. I've been playing the Pokemon TCG for just about 6 months now, and getting back into the game has been a blast. After 6 solid months of ride or die with Pikarom, I've gotten a pretty good handle on the basics of the game, and I've adapted about as well as anyone could expect to the world of big basics and even bigger VMAXs. And now, here I am after my sealed only trial, wondering what's next? Well, I want to challenge myself. And if you've been watching my channel recently, you know there's no better place to start off a challenge than with a pair of theme decks. Groudon and Kyogre are my two favorite Pokemon from my favorite generation, and since Cosmic Eclipse is the set where I got back into the game, I knew I needed to do something special with these particular theme decks. But before you go thinking that I'm going to smush these two together, let me assure you that I am not in fact a crazy person. No, I'll be upgrading these individually as part of a short series that kicks off with this episode that you're watching right now. And as is tradition, I've purchased a pair of each theme deck, and I'll be using those as the starting points for more competitive builds. But unlike my typical theme deck upgrades, I'm setting some pretty strict rules to make sure that I'm really challenging myself. What rules? Well, there's 3 of them. 1. I must use at least 2 copies of the box legendaries in their respective decks. 2. I need to preserve at least 1 full evolutionary line from each deck, which are Garchomp and Empoleon for each deck specifically. And 3. I'm limited to just 2 multi-prize Pokemon in each deck, but tag teams and VMAXs are forbidden. The idea behind these rules is to recapture the spirit of the game as it was originally conceived. I want to take my favorite Pokemon into battle, evolve them up, and play more thoughtful and slowly paced games. I want to strip away the busted mechanics and play in a way that's going to force me to rely on intelligent gameplay, and admittedly a bit of luck, to take on a field of bigger, tougher opponents. In the first builds of these decks, I want to keep things simple, straightforward, and true to the core of each one as possible. So this week's upgrades will mostly just consist of upgrading each pair of theme decks with a pair of Trainer's Toolkits. Now, as far as value goes, whether you're a beginner or a pro looking to flesh out a competitive deck, you really can't do better than the Trainer's Toolkit. And besides that, I'm only adding what I consider to be a few absolutely essential singles to start things off. The Groudon deck from Cosmic Eclipse is, as far as I'm concerned, a gold standard for theme decks. This deck is built around not 1, but 2 well thought out strategies, which makes upgrading it a lot more straightforward. First, there's the self-damage mechanic, focusing on the Seismitoad line. Palpitoad lets you hit for 60 at the cost of doing 10 damage to each of your bench Pokemon, and Seismitoad can do 80 damage plus 30 more for each of your bench Pokemon with a damage counter on it. This pairs very well with the throw included in the deck, which can smack for 120 damage for 2 energy so long as you have one other Pokemon with a damage counter on it. That's pretty bonkers. Then there's the mechanic of playing from behind. The Garchomp in this deck hits for 80 more damage if the opponent is ahead in prizes, which as it is already a pretty common game state, and in this particular deck is fairly easy to achieve considering the fact that your Pokemon can damage themselves with their own attacks. As for Groudon itself, it's basically there to accelerate energy, take a hit, and retreat to the bench after making things like Garchomp and Throw live. So, aside from the staple cards coming out of the Trainer's Toolkit, there's one card in particular that I think is an automatic conclusion for this deck. Martial Arts Dojo. This stadium lets any of your Pokemon with a fighting energy attached to it hit for 40 more damage if your opponent is ahead in the prize race. This pairs really well with Garchomp, allowing it to hit some huge numbers for a single prize Pokemon. The only other card that I think merits inclusion in this deck automatically anyway is Recycle Energy. Garchomp can further buff its damage out if you discard an energy while using its attack, and since its attack takes 1 colorless energy, the Recycle Energy is a pretty straightforward inclusion. Also, this helps mitigate the losses as many of our Pokemon are easily knocked out, and makes crushing hammers a little easier to deal with if you always make sure to place the Recycle Energy first. And the rest of our upgrades are pretty straightforward. In a deck where a Stage 2 is our main damage dealer, rare candies are a must, And I'm splitting up my two multi-prizer slots between Dedenne GX and Oricorio GX, both of which give a bit of extra draw power in a pinch. So that's the Groudon deck. Now let's jump on over to the Kyogre deck and see what we're working with there. Now, this deck, as much as I love Kyogre, is not quite on the level of Groudon's. Or rather, I should say that it's very good in a vacuum or when faced with other theme decks, but it's just not equipped to take on the metagame as it is now. This deck is built around the mechanic of relatively powerful and interesting attacks at the cost of discarding energy or returning energy to the hand. And while that can often be good, see Pikachu VMAX, Lapras V, it's a little less so in a deck where the only worthwhile attacker is a stage 2 that actually can't take advantage of rare candies because of the way that its mechanics work. Now, that one worthwhile attacker, Empoleon, has a very unique mechanic in that it can use attacks from its previous evolutions for a single energy, and those attacks can either stun the active or snipe the bench, which is fantastic. The deck even includes a Hoenn to help you force troublesome attackers out of the active to facilitate you ripping into the bench. But the problem is that one of Empoleon's recall attacks requires that you discard all energies attached to it, which in most situations is fine because the recall attack itself only takes one energy. But this does compound the fact that Empoleon's damage output is pretty pitiful for a stage 2 Pokemon. So the central strategy of this deck isn't quite what I'd like it to be, which means that it's going to require a more significant adjustment than the Groudon deck. So what I'm going to do here is build the deck in the most wicked, evil way I can possible. I need to get Empoleon in the active and let it go to town on my opponent's bench without fear of reprisal. So I'm going to take advantage of things like Absol, Galar Mine, and Crushing Hammers to leave something stranded in the active while I deal damage safely. It's also a nice way to stall things out while I evolve up my penguins. Yes, it's not sexy, but it'll work. And of course, there's a lot of obvious consistency cards like Pokemon Communication and Evolution Incense, which are particularly important here because, as I mentioned before, you have to evolve up Empoleon at every stage if you want it to work the way it's intended. And of course, Dedenne goes in here as well because we need that draw power, and we don't really have anything else that seems like a good fit at the moment. And that's the Kyogre deck. This one admittedly will take a bit more work to make competitively viable, but I did say I wanted a challenge, so yeah. Anyway, with the decks built, it's time to take them into battle. And because this is a very special episode, the battles are going to look a little different than usual. And while they will only come in at one apiece, I think you're going to enjoy what I've done here. So let's grab our Kyogre deck, jump on into game 1, and get this show on the road. And that wraps up our first foray into this very special series. These were some of the scrappiest games I've had in a long time, and I think it's no coincidence that both of my opponents were also rocking some seriously interesting one prize decks. Both games took between 15 to 20 minutes in their original runtime, which is on another level from what I'm used to playing in a format full of tag teams and VMAXs. If I can have more games like this going forward, I'm going to be a very happy boy. And in looking ahead, you're probably wondering when the next episode of this series is going to be. So shows like this take a little longer to produce because of all the animation, things like actually filming, and I also want to take the time to grow with the series, so this isn't really something I want to just bang out over the course of a week. So these episodes are going to be a monthly affair. And while you wait for the next installment of Hoenn Legends, I will of course have the usual Pokemon goodness ready for you every week. And with that, I hope you all enjoyed the show. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and of course, take it easy.